What if a single act of kindness could change a life? When young Tommy gave his lunch money to a stranger on the street, he had no idea what would happen next. The very next day, a mysterious visitor arrived at his school, and what followed was a series of events that would alter Tommy's life forever. The air was crisp that Tuesday morning, a thin veil of mist hanging in the schoolyard as children hurried through the gates. Laughter and chatter filled the space, a symphony of youthful energy bouncing off the walls of Maplewood Elementary. But not everyone was caught up in the morning rush. Among the throng of students, a small boy named Tommy walked alone, his steps slow and deliberate as he kicked at a stray pebble on the pavement. Tommy was 8 years old, with messy brown hair that often fell into his eyes and a backpack almost too big for his slight frame. He wasn't in a hurry, he never was. Tommy liked to take his time, to notice the world around him, and today was no different. As he approached the corner of Pine Street, something unusual caught his eye. A man sat slumped against the brick wall of the old bookstore, his clothes tattered and face hidden behind a scraggly beard. He was thin, too thin, Tommy thought, and his hands trembled slightly as he held out a small paper cup. Most people hurried past, their eyes fixed ahead, avoiding the man's gaze. But Tommy stopped. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man's sad, tired eyes made him pause. Tommy felt a pang of recognition in those eyes, as if they reflected a loneliness he sometimes felt when he was ignored or teased at school. The boy stood there for a moment, watching. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Tommy's. They were a dull gray, clouded with a weariness that Tommy couldn't fully understand, but there was something else there too, something that pulled at the boy's heart. Tommy hesitated, glancing down at his pocket. He knew he had $2 tucked inside, the exact amount his mom had given him for lunch that morning. His stomach grumbled at the thought. He hadn't had breakfast, and Mrs. Sims' class was right before lunch, which meant it would be a long wait. But as he looked back at the man, Tommy felt a strange tug in his chest, something he couldn't quite explain. He imagined what it would feel like to sit on the cold sidewalk, hungry and alone, with everyone passing by as if you didn't exist. With quiet determination, Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills. They were warm from being clutched in his hand, and for a second, he almost turned away. But then he thought of how hungry the man must be, how cold he looked sitting there on the sidewalk. Tommy took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding out the money. "Here," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He didn't move at first, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the bills from Tommy's hand, his fingers brushing the boy's briefly. "Thank you," the man croaked, his voice rough and hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just relief. But whatever it was, it made Tommy feel warm inside, despite the cold morning air. Tommy nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't say anything else, unsure of what more there was to say. Instead, he simply turned and began to walk away, his backpack bouncing slightly with each step. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, something that he didn't quite understand yet. As he made his way to school, Tommy's mind was a whirl of thoughts. He didn't regret giving the man his lunch money, but now he had a new problem. What was he going to do for lunch? He didn't have any other money, and he doubted he could last until he got home that afternoon without eating. He supposed he could ask his friend Ben to share, but the idea of asking for help made Tommy feel uncomfortable. He didn't like to be a burden on others, and besides, Ben didn't always have enough to eat himself. The school bell rang, pulling Tommy out of his thoughts. He quickened his pace, hurrying through the front doors just as Mrs. Sims was about to close them. "Cutting it close again, Tommy," she said with a gentle smile. "Go on, get to class." Tommy nodded, offering her a quick smile in return before darting down the hallway to his classroom. He slid into his seat just as the bell rang again, signaling the start of the day. The usual hum of the classroom surrounded him, but Tommy found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the man on the street and the look in his eyes when Tommy had handed him the money. The morning passed in a blur. Tommy tried to pay attention to Mrs. Sims' lesson on fractions, but his stomach growled, reminding him of his earlier decision. When the lunch bell finally rang, Tommy felt a pang of worry. He watched as his classmates grabbed their lunches and headed for the cafeteria, but he stayed behind, unsure of what to do. Tommy lingered by his desk, pretending to be interested in the drawings on the wall. He didn't want anyone to notice he didn't have lunch. After a few minutes, the classroom was empty, and Tommy slowly made his way outside, finding a quiet spot under a tree in the far corner of the playground. He sat down, pulling his knees up to his chest, and tried to ignore the gnawing hunger in his belly. But as he sat there, something unexpected happened. The faces of his classmates, the chatter and laughter that filled the playground, all faded into the background. Instead, Tommy found himself thinking about the man again, about the look of surprise and gratitude on his face. It made Tommy feel a little less hungry, a little less alone. The afternoon passed in much the same way as the morning. Tommy went through the motions of the school day, but his mind was elsewhere. When the final bell rang, he gathered his things and headed home, his steps slower than usual. That evening, as he sat at the dinner table, Tommy's mom noticed he was quieter than usual. "Everything okay, Tommy?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired," he mumbled, poking at his food. His mom studied him for a moment, then let it go. But as Tommy lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about the man. He wondered what had happened to him, where he was now, and whether the $2 had made any difference. Tommy didn't know it then, but that small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. As he drifted off to sleep, Tommy decided he would check the corner again tomorrow, just to see if the man was still there. He didn't know what he would do if he was, but something told him it was important. With that thought in mind, Tommy closed his eyes, unaware of the unexpected visitor who would soon walk into his life, bringing with him a lesson Tommy would carry with him forever. The next day dawned with a heavy fog clinging to the town like a blanket, making everything seem quiet and muffled. Tommy's breath puffed out in little clouds as he walked to school, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early morning. He was still thinking about the man he'd seen the day before, wondering if he'd be at the corner again, but when he reached the bookstore, the spot where the man had been was empty. Tommy stood there for a moment, staring at the vacant sidewalk. A strange sense of disappointment settled over him, even though he wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe he thought the man would be there again, that he'd be able to give him something more, though what, Tommy didn't know. He glanced around, but the street was quiet, with only a few early risers out for their morning routines. With a small sigh, Tommy turned and continued on to school. The fog hadn't lifted by the time he reached Maplewood Elementary. As he walked through the school gates, the familiar sights and sounds of the playground began to fill the air, the thud of a basketball, the shrill cries of kids playing tag, the low hum of conversations. It was comforting in its own way, yet today, Tommy felt a bit out of place. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was different, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Tommy made his way to his classroom, slipping into his seat just as the bell rang. Mrs. Sims began the day's lesson, but Tommy found it hard to concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting back to the empty corner, to the man who had seemed so sad and tired. He wondered where the man had gone, if he was okay, if he had found something to eat. But there were no answers, just the steady drone of Mrs. Sims' voice as she explained long division. It wasn't until just before lunch that something finally broke the monotony of the morning. The loudspeaker crackled to life, and the principal's voice came on, startling everyone out of their daydreams. "Attention, students and staff," the principal's voice boomed, a bit more excited than usual. "We have a special assembly today. Please make your way to the auditorium immediately." A ripple of confusion and curiosity swept through the classroom. Assemblies were usually announced well in advance, with flyers sent home to parents. An unexpected assembly was practically unheard of. Tommy felt a flicker of curiosity as he stood up with the rest of the class, grabbing his jacket and following the stream of students heading toward the auditorium. The hallway buzzed with chatter, everyone speculating about the reason for the sudden assembly. Some of the kids guessed it was about a special guest or maybe a surprise announcement. Tommy didn't say much, his mind still partly occupied with thoughts of the man from the day before. But as they entered the auditorium and took their seats, he couldn't help but feel a small knot of anticipation forming in his stomach. The auditorium was filled quickly, the sound of hundreds of kids finding their seats blending into a dull roar. Tommy sat near the middle, with his friend Ben beside him. The stage at the front was empty except for a microphone stand, and the principal stood nearby, her hands clasped together, looking out over the crowd with a wide smile. "Who do you think it is?" Ben whispered to Tommy, his eyes wide with excitement. Tommy shrugged, though he couldn't deny that he was curious too. "I don't know. Maybe someone important?" Before they could speculate further, the principal stepped up to the microphone, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice warm and welcoming. "Thank you all for coming to this special assembly. Today, we have a very special guest who wants to share something important with you." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Tommy leaned forward slightly in his seat, his curiosity piqued. The principal gestured toward the side of the stage, and for a moment, there was silence as everyone waited. Then, a man walked out onto the stage, and Tommy's heart skipped a beat. It was him. The man from the corner. But he looked different. Gone were the tattered clothes and the scraggly beard. In their place was a well-groomed man in a crisp suit, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. He walked with confidence, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he approached the microphone. For a moment, Tommy couldn't believe his eyes. It was as if he was seeing a completely different person, yet he knew without a doubt that it was the same man. The man cleared his throat, his voice steady and calm as he began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mr. Collins, and I want to share a story with you today, a story about kindness, and how a small act can make a big difference." Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. The voice was familiar, though much clearer and stronger than it had been the day before. He was too stunned to process anything else at first, his mind racing to piece together how this man had gone from sitting on a street corner to standing on stage in front of the whole school. "I was in a difficult place," Mr. Collins continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I had lost my way, both in life and in spirit. But yesterday, something happened that changed everything for me. A young boy, who didn't know me at all, gave me his lunch money. It was just $2, but to me, it meant the world. That small act of kindness reminded me that there is still good in the world, that people care, even about strangers." Tommy felt a blush creeping up his neck as he realized Mr. Collins was talking about him. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how hot the room felt, even though no one else knew who the boy in the story was. He ducked his head, hoping no one would notice him, but his mind was spinning with questions. Why was Mr. Collins here? How had his life changed so much in just one day? Mr. Collins continued speaking, his voice filled with emotion. "That boy didn't know it, but he gave me more than just money. He gave me hope. Hope that I could turn my life around, that I could be someone my family could be proud of again. And that's why I'm here today, to thank him, and to let all of you know that kindness, no matter how small, can make a world of difference." Tommy's hands gripped the edge of his seat as he listened, a strange mix of pride and embarrassment washing over him. He had never expected anything like this to happen. He had just wanted to help someone who looked like they needed it, but now it seemed like his small gesture had set off a chain of events that he couldn't have predicted. "And to show my gratitude," Mr. Collins said, his voice growing stronger, "I've decided to make a donation to this school's lunch program. From now on, no child here will have to worry about going hungry during the school day." The room erupted into applause, but Tommy barely noticed. His mind was still reeling from everything he had just heard. The man he had given his lunch money to had turned out to be someone important, someone who had come to their school to share a message about the very thing Tommy had done without a second thought. As the applause died down, Mr. Collins looked out over the crowd, his gaze lingering on the rows of students. "I don't know who that boy is," he said, his voice softer now, "but I hope he knows how much his kindness meant to me. And I hope that all of you will carry that message with you, and remember that even the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's life." With that, Mr. Collins stepped back from the microphone, giving a small nod to the principal, who returned to the stage to close the assembly. The students began to file out of the auditorium, buzzing with excitement about the unexpected visit and the generous donation. But Tommy stayed in his seat for a moment longer, his thoughts swirling. He had wanted to help, and in doing so, he had made a difference. But more than that, he had seen firsthand how a small act of kindness could ripple out and affect so many others. As he finally stood up and made his way back to class, Tommy couldn't help but wonder what would happen next, and whether he would ever get the chance to talk to Mr. Collins again. The assembly had left a buzz of excitement that lingered long after the students returned to their classrooms. Tommy walked back to his seat in a daze, the clamor of his classmates barely registering in his mind. All he could think about was the man, Mr. Collins, and the way his story had unfolded so unexpectedly. The realization that his small gesture had sparked something so profound left Tommy feeling both amazed and overwhelmed. As the class settled back into their seats, Mrs. Sims picked up where she had left off before the assembly, but the atmosphere was different now, charged with the energy of what had just happened. It was clear that everyone had been touched by Mr. Collins' story, though no one knew just how close to home it had hit for Tommy. Tommy tried to focus on the lesson, but his thoughts kept drifting. He replayed Mr. Collins' words over and over in his head, the way he had talked about kindness and the impact it could have. Tommy hadn't expected anything in return for giving away his lunch money. He had just wanted to help, to do something good. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. When the lunch bell finally rang, Tommy found himself trailing behind the other kids as they headed to the cafeteria. The thought of sitting with his friends, pretending everything was normal, felt strange to him now. Instead, he found himself wandering the hallways, his feet carrying him without direction. He ended up in a quiet corner of the school, near the library, where he often went when he needed a place to think. The noise of the cafeteria was distant, muffled by the thick walls of the old building. Tommy leaned against the cool brick, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As he stood there, lost in thought, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Mrs. Sims standing a few feet away, her usual warm smile softened with concern. "Tommy, are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice cutting through the quiet. Tommy hesitated, unsure how to answer. He knew he couldn't tell her everything that was swirling in his mind, he barely understood it himself. But he could see the kindness in Mrs. Sims' eyes, the way she was waiting patiently for him to respond, and it made him want to try. I guess I'm just thinking about what Mr. Collins said," Tommy replied, his voice quiet. "About how a little kindness can make a big difference." Mrs. Sims nodded, stepping closer and leaning against the wall beside him. It was a powerful message, wasn't it? It's amazing to see how one small action can ripple out and affect so many people. Tommy glanced down at his shoes, kicking at a small pebble on the ground. Yeah, but what if that small action was something I did? What if I was the one who gave him the lunch money? The words were out before Tommy could stop them, and he immediately felt a rush of panic. What if Mrs. Sims told everyone? What if people started treating him differently? But when he looked up, he saw nothing but understanding in her eyes. Mrs. Sims didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, giving Tommy time to process what he had just admitted. Finally, she reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tommy, if you were the one who helped Mr. Collins, then you should be proud of what you did. You didn't do it for recognition or praise, you did it because you have a kind heart. And that's what makes all the difference." Tommy felt his throat tighten with emotion. He hadn't expected her to say that, to make him feel like what he had done was something special. He had just been trying to do the right thing. But hearing it from Mrs. Sims made him realize that maybe, just maybe, his actions had mattered more than he had thought. "But I don't want people to know," Tommy said, his voice wavering slightly. "I didn't do it to get attention." Mrs. Sims nodded, her expression serious. "And you don't have to tell anyone if you don't want to. This can be something you carry with you, a reminder of the kind of person you are. But remember, Tommy, sometimes the world needs to see acts of kindness. It reminds others that they can make a difference too." Tommy thought about that, turning her words over in his mind. He hadn't considered that before, how seeing someone else do something good might inspire others to do the same. It was a comforting thought, but it also felt like a lot of responsibility for an 8-year-old. Mrs. Sims must have sensed his hesitation because she smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, Tommy. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Just keep being you, and everything will fall into place." Tommy nodded, feeling a little lighter. Mrs. Sims always had a way of making things seem less complicated. He felt grateful that she had been the one to find him, that she had listened without judgment. As the lunch period began to wind down, Mrs. Sims stood up, offering Tommy her hand. "Come on, let's get back to class. I think we still have some time left to finish that math lesson." Tommy took her hand, feeling a sense of relief as they walked back together. The hallways were quieter now, with most of the students already back in their classrooms. When they reached the door to their room, Mrs. Sims gave Tommy a quick smile before they both slipped inside. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but this time, Tommy felt more at ease. He paid attention in class, answered questions when Mrs. Sims called on him, and even managed to enjoy some of the math problems. But all the while, in the back of his mind, he kept thinking about what Mrs. Sims had said. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Tommy gathered his things and headed for the door. He was halfway down the hallway when he heard his name being called. Turning around, he saw Mr. Collins standing near the office, talking to the principal. Tommy froze, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to turn around and run, to avoid any confrontation, but another part of him, the part that had given his lunch money to a stranger, felt a tug to go forward. Mr. Collins looked up at that moment and caught sight of Tommy. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Tommy saw the same look of gratitude in Mr. Collins' eyes that he had seen on the street. But this time, there was something else there too, recognition. Tommy's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He found himself walking toward Mr. Collins, his heart pounding in his chest. The principal excused herself, leaving the two of them alone in the hallway. "Tommy, right?" Mr. Collins said, his voice warm. "I'm glad I got the chance to see you." Tommy nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Mr. Collins seemed to understand because he smiled gently and continued. "I wanted to thank you again," Mr. Collins said. "I didn't get the chance to do it properly before, but you need to know how much what you did meant to me. You didn't have to give me anything, but you did. And that kindness, it changed everything for me." Tommy looked up at Mr. Collins, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside him. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said quietly. "I just wanted to help." "And that's exactly why it meant so much," Mr. Collins replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me that there's still good in the world, and that's something I won't ever forget." Tommy didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. Mr. Collins reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out to Tommy. "Here," he said. "I wanted to give you something in return. It's nothing big, just a little something to say thank you." Tommy hesitated, then took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hand. He didn't open it right away, just held it close as he looked up at Mr. Collins. "Thank you," Tommy whispered, the words barely audible. Mr. Collins smiled and placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "No, Tommy. Thank_you_. As Tommy walked home that day, the envelope still clutched in his hand, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that whatever was inside wasn't as important as the connection he had made with Mr. Collins, the way their lives had intersected in such an unexpected and meaningful way. When he finally got home, Tommy opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note from Mr. Collins, thanking him once again for his kindness, along with a small card for a local summer camp. The card was for a scholarship to attend a camp focused on leadership and community service. Tommy stared at the card, feeling a swell of excitement and nervousness. The idea of going to camp, of learning how to help others even more, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He knew that this was just the beginning of something new, something that would continue to shape him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As he lay in bed that night, the card tucked safely under his pillow, Tommy thought about the way one small act of kindness had changed everything. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he would keep looking for ways to help, to make a difference, just like Mrs. Sims and Mr. Collins had said. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Summer arrived with the hum of cicadas and long, sun-drenched days that seemed to stretch on forever. For Tommy, those days were filled with a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation as he prepared for his first experience at the leadership camp Mr. Collins had recommended. The camp was nestled in the mountains, a place where the air was crisp and the nights were filled with stars. It was unlike anything Tommy had ever experienced, and the thought of it both thrilled and scared him. On the morning he left for camp, Tommy's parents drove him to the bus station, where a group of kids his age were already gathering. His mom fussed over him, making sure he had everything he needed, while his dad gave him a reassuring pat on the back. Tommy appreciated their support, but his mind was already at camp, imagining what it would be like to meet new people and learn new things. When the bus finally pulled up, Tommy felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. He hugged his parents goodbye and boarded the bus, finding a seat near the window. As the bus pulled away, he watched his parents wave until they were just small dots in the distance. Then, he turned his attention to the road ahead, a mix of trepidation and excitement bubbling within him. The journey to the camp took a few hours, the bus winding its way through forests and up into the mountains. The other kids chatted and laughed, but Tommy remained quiet, taking in the scenery and letting his thoughts wander. He thought about Mr. Collins and what he had said about leadership and kindness. Tommy didn't know what to expect from the camp, but he hoped it would help him figure out how to make a bigger difference, just like Mr. Collins had suggested. When the bus finally arrived at the camp, Tommy stepped off and took a deep breath, letting the fresh mountain air fill his lungs. The camp was beautiful, with log cabins nestled among the trees and a sparkling lake in the distance. Counselors greeted the kids as they got off the bus, directing them to their cabins and introducing them to their cabin mates. Tommy found himself in a cabin with 3 other boys who all seemed friendly and excited to be there. They introduced themselves, Jake, Ethan, and Ryan, and soon they were talking about what they were looking forward to at camp. Tommy felt a bit more at ease, relieved that he wasn't the only one feeling nervous about the new experience. The first few days of camp were a whirlwind of activities, from team-building exercises to leadership workshops. The counselors were enthusiastic and encouraging, helping the campers push beyond their comfort zones and discover new strengths. Tommy quickly realized that this camp wasn't just about having fun, it was about learning how to work with others, how to lead with empathy, and how to bring out the best in everyone around you. One afternoon, during a leadership exercise, the campers were divided into groups and given a challenge: build a raft using only the materials provided and get it across the lake. It was a test of teamwork, problem-solving, and communication, and Tommy found himself in a group with his cabin mates. At first, the group struggled. Everyone had different ideas about how to build the raft, and there was a lot of talking over each other and not enough listening. Frustration started to build, and it seemed like they were getting nowhere. But then Tommy remembered something Mr. Collins had said: leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, it's about bringing people together. Taking a deep breath, Tommy spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Guys, let's take a step back for a second. We're all trying to do the right thing, but we need to work together if we're going to get this done. Let's start by listening to each other's ideas and then figure out how we can combine them. The other boys looked at him, surprised by his sudden assertion, but then they nodded in agreement. They took turns sharing their ideas, and soon they had a plan that everyone contributed to. As they worked together to build the raft, the tension eased, and the group began to function as a team. When the raft was finally finished, they pushed it into the water and climbed aboard, paddling with all their strength. The raft held together, and with a lot of effort and cheering each other on, they made it across the lake. When they reached the other side, the group erupted into triumphant cheers, proud of what they had accomplished together. That night, as Tommy lay in his bunk, he thought about the day's events. He realized that leadership wasn't just about making decisions or being in charge, it was about helping others find their voice, about creating an environment where everyone felt valued and heard. It was about kindness, the same kind of kindness he had shown Mr. Collins on that cold morning so many months ago. As the weeks passed, Tommy continued to grow and learn at camp. He made new friends, learned new skills, and discovered things about himself that he hadn't known before. He realized that leadership wasn't something you were born with, it was something you learned through experience, through making mistakes and learning from them, through helping others and being helped in return. On the last night of camp, there was a special ceremony around the campfire. The counselors handed out awards, recognizing campers for their achievements over the past few weeks. When they called Tommy's name, he was surprised but pleased. He walked up to the front, where the head counselor handed him a small plaque. For showing leadership through kindness and helping others find their strength, the counselor said, smiling at Tommy. You've shown us all what it means to lead with empathy and heart. Tommy felt a surge of pride as he accepted the plaque, the warmth of the campfire reflecting the warmth he felt inside. It wasn't about the award, though, it was about what it represented. It was a reminder of the journey he had been on, from that simple act of kindness on the street to this moment by the fire. As he sat back down with his cabin mates, the night sky filled with stars, Tommy thought about how far he had come. He knew that his journey wasn't over, there were still many more opportunities to help others, to make a difference in the world. But for now, he was content to sit by the fire, surrounded by friends, and enjoy the moment. The next morning, as the campers packed up and prepared to leave, Tommy felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. He was sad to leave the camp, but he was also excited to return home and apply everything he had learned. He knew that his experience at camp had changed him, had given him the tools he needed to continue making a difference in the world. As the bus pulled away from the camp, Tommy looked out the window at the mountains in the distance, feeling a sense of peace. He knew that he was ready for whatever came next, that he had the strength and the heart to face any challenge. When he arrived home, his parents were waiting for him at the bus stop. They hugged him tightly, asking about his time at camp and what he had learned. Tommy smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for their support. It was amazing, he said simply, but he knew they could see in his eyes how much the experience had meant to him. That night, as Tommy lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened since the day he gave his lunch money to Mr. Collins. He realized that the small act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many more opportunities to help others, to lead with kindness, and to make the world a better place. And with that thought, Tommy smiled, knowing that he was ready for whatever the future held.